So Jason McKinney is a reverend as well as an academic who focuses on the theology of hospitality. He's an Anglican priest, and his parish is one that he is trying to understand how to bring the sacred into all aspects of life, into the community, and try to allow his church to be a common good to his neighborhood.
Great. Thank you, Jesse. And just to echo what's already been said from Jesse and around the room, how excited I am to be here. So many people that I know, a few people that I don't, but I think the conversation is going to be rich, even if I didn't offer anything now. But also to say that that image of jazz, and I think my job is to help to lay down that melody line so that there can be some improvisation throughout the day, but I sort of fear that I may be improvising already. So I'm going to make this offering anyway. As Jesse said, I have thought really deeply about hospitality, but I also want to be clear that I have thought deeply in the way that I think about it, which is not the only way to think about it. And so this is going to reflect the way that I've approached this, the traditions that I've followed into this, and I hope it's a useful offering for our conversation. So what I want to do is draw out some of the theological stakes of hospitality. I want to do that by drawing on my own experience. I want to describe 4 scenes from my life, and then to begin to draw on some of those threads. So the first scene is me as a young child. I grew up in a home where my father worked as a dean of students in a place very much like Tyndale. And so he would often invite students over for meals, for weekend events, for holidays. And so from very early on, I had the sense that when you open your domestic space, when you open your home to strangers, it can be safe and it can be enjoyable. So that was one of my earliest experiences of hospitality. Noting that these strangers were not really the strangest people, because they were really people like us. They were people who shared our religious tradition. They were people who had the means to attend a private Christian college. They were on their best behavior at the dean's house. But there was still something significant about this low-risk experience of hospitality early on in my life, where a practice of welcome, even if it was modest, and a posture of openness to the other was being cultivated in me from an early age. So the theological lesson that I draw from this low-stakes or quotidian hospitality is that quotidian hospitality actually really matters. It matters because it builds a kind of muscle memory within us in the practice of welcome. And it also, I think, develops neural pathways between the practice of hospitality and the experience of pleasure or joy. And I think those are really important for a sustainable ethical practice of hospitality. So this practice, I think, is crucial in our increasingly cruel and inhospitable world. But I do think that if that practice isn't tied to this experience of pleasure, which I think is tied to the experience of conviviality, of a shared space with others, usually around food, that the practice isn't going to be sustainable. So not everyone will have had the same early experience of hospitality that I did, but I think, and I suspect we could even do a survey across the room of all of you folks who are engaged in practices of hospitality, is that somehow you've been able to build that connection between that practice and some feature of joy or celebration or conviviality. So it's Sister Joan Chittister, in her rule about the rule of St. Benedict, says that hospitality is one of those things that has to be constantly practiced, or it won't be there on the rare occasion. So quotidian hospitality really matters. The second scene, I was a graduate student in Vancouver. I found myself living in a Christian community in the downtown east side of the city. And one of the practices of this community was an open door policy. So every dinner was open to anybody who showed up. And if you know the downtown east side, that really could be anybody. So it was here that I discovered, and this is the theological lesson, that hospitality can be radical. So it can be offered to people who were not like me, people who from a distance anyway appeared to be broken or compromised or dangerous. So I'm thinking that we could consider hospitality on a kind of a spectrum, with quotidian or low-risk hospitality at one extreme of that spectrum, and radical, high-risk, unpredictable hospitality at the other end of that spectrum, but still of a consistent practice even across that spectrum. But on the radical end of that spectrum, where things are riskier and more uncertain, it's still not all work and labor and struggle. It has its own blessings. So what might be lacking in terms of security is often more than compensated for in the experience of a shared meal across real difference or a meaningful encounter with a true stranger, something that you don't really experience in suburban style quotidian hospitality. But in this domain of radical hospitality, a kind of paradox emerges, because if you open up that question that hospitality could be more radical, you open up the possibility that it will never be radical enough. So the limits of quotidian or everyday hospitality are arbitrary, but we do set them. It's the privilege of the host or the one who controls the space to exercise power, to decide who to invite, to ask certain expectations of them, to tell them when they should leave, usually in nice ways, but still it is their prerogative. And in suburban middle-class settings, this is normal. This is how hospitality works. But once you begin to shed the kind of bourgeois assumptions about hospitality as entertainment, those limits that we set begin to show themselves to be a lot more arbitrary. They begin to show themselves as discretionary, or in any case, not at all self-evident, why the boundary is here and not here. So why do we need someone's name before they enter our home? Why would someone who is high or intoxicated not be allowed to join us for dinner? Why should they be expected to tell us their story as we sit across the table from them? And why should they leave after the meal if they don't have a home to go to? So we're drifting into pretty complicated practical and conceptual territory with hospitality. And as I became more and more interested in this conceptual terrain, I was led to the third scene that I want to describe. And that's me moving to Toronto to study and eventually to teach about hospitality. And this is where the specificity of my trajectory into this question is going to show itself. And this is not a trajectory that everyone needs to follow. But I began my PhD studies at the University of Toronto, and one of the first graduate courses that I ever took was a graduate seminar on the French philosopher Emmanuel Levinas, who Mary Jo knows well. And it was taught by the renowned Levinas scholar who would eventually become my teacher, Robert Gibbs. So hospitality is a central theme for Levinas, and I won't get into the weeds of his thinking on that, but I think that there is one insight that's worth our attention, and that's the way that he pushes the role of the host toward greater and greater vulnerability. So in his first major philosophical work, he conceived of ethical hospitality as modeled on Abraham in Genesis 18. The Lord appeared to Abraham at the oaks of Mamre as he sat at the entrance of his tent in the heat of the day. He looked up and saw 3 men standing near him. He saw them, he ran from the tent entrance to meet them and bowed down to the ground. So Abraham demonstrates that the stranger who comes upon us and interrupts our comfort and security is not to be ignored, but to be welcomed and honored extravagantly. But then Levinas pushes that in his next major philosophical work and begins to question whether the prerequisites of wealth and security are necessary for hospitality to be practiced. So what if I don't have shelter to offer or a feast to prepare for this guest who comes? Is not the stranger then entitled even to the bread from my mouth? That was Levinas's really difficult question that he asked. So what I take from this is not a call to a sort of self-destructive practice of hospitality, but a call to a deeper reflection on what it means to welcome. And in particular, a critical attention to the conditions that make radical hospitality necessary in the first place. And for me, that's becoming more and more the key question. What is it that makes radical hospitality necessary in the first place? So I move to my final scene and I conclude here, which is a gathering of friends and strangers around an ordinary dinner table. So as I said, I think that quotidian, this everyday practice of hospitality matters. It matters because it creates those associations between welcome and pleasure. It links the threshold or the entrance of the home to the interior of the home and the conviviality that can happen there. And it makes radical hospitality more likely, again, like Joan Chittister says, because it exercises that muscle memory so that when the situation is dire, you're prepared to respond. But it matters in another respect as well. We can think about radical hospitality as a work of repair. And we can think about quotidian hospitality as possibly a practice of prefiguration. So I'll say what I mean by those two, and I'm wrapping up here. Radical hospitality tries to change the conditions of an inhospitable world through particular practices, local practices. Quotidian hospitality creates the conditions of a redeemed world. So I'll say that again, or make that distinction again. Radical hospitality tries to change the conditions of an inhospitable world. Quotidian hospitality creates the conditions of a redeemed world. It's a foretaste of the banquet of heaven, is another way to put it. Radical hospitality is necessary under the conditions of our broken, cruel, and unwelcoming world. Rampant houselessness, racism and xenophobia, wealth disparity, climate disaster. We need more radical hospitality in our world to remedy these problems. But we can demand that radical hospitality, I think, from our institutions, from our governments, and perhaps from those rare saints who are able to give the bread even from their mouth. So radical hospitality is an essential means to an end. And it's also an important set of political demands. And I'm looking at Alexa on this one in particular, a demand for opening 24-hour warming centers, a demand for unlimited shelter beds, a demand for affordable housing for everyone, open borders. And these are demands that continue to need to be made so that radical hospitality is something that we need to demand of those institutions and those states that are setting these boundaries. But on the other hand, hospitality can also be prefigurative and even sacramental because it's a performance of the very ends that we desire. So it's not a means to an end, but it's a practice of those ends. So the deepest theological possibility of hospitality is the convivial atmosphere of friends and strangers gathered together at a table. So that's the offering. Again, it's maybe not the main melody line, but it is a reflection on the broad theme of hospitality. So I hope that's a helpful opening to our conversations today.